So most of you are familiar with the Platypus affiliated society here. We are an educational organization that hosts reading groups, public panels like this, and we also engage in journalism, which you can see in our Platypus review that's over there for free, where we engage the tasks and problems inherited from the 1930s old left, the 1960s new left, and the 1990s post-political left. So first I'm going to just, I guess, describe the format and then introduce the speakers, and then we'll go from there. The format is like each speaker will open up doing 10 minutes. I guess I'll just give you guys, like, raise my hand when you have like 1 minute left. Yeah. And then afterwards they will respond to each other for about 3 to 4 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, introducing the speakers, Urszula Wislanka to my left. Hopefully I'm not butchering that.
It's fine.
Probably am. Okay. I just go in with like, okay, it's gonna be like that. All right. She's a longtime activist and a Marxist humanist. Currently, she focuses on the inside of prisoners, specifically women prisoners, because it might share what needs to change to get a better human society for all. She is a member of News and Letters Committees and the California Coalition for Women Prisoners and the Pelican Bay Hunger Strike Support Coalition. Cavern over here.
You butchered that too, but it's okay.
Okay. You guys can butcher my name later. Okay. Cavern, let's just go with it, is a member of the International Marxist Tendency and the Refoundation Caucus of the Democratic Socialists of America. The IMT organizes for the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism in more than 30 countries across the world. Cavern believes the primary task of Marxists in the United States is the establishment of a mass socialist party based on the working class as a whole. All right, and give Richard Becker's introduction. Richard Becker is a founding member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation and a member of the party's Central Committee. He is the author of Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire, and The Myth of Democracy and the Rule of the Banks. And he is also the co-author of Storming the Gates, How the Russian Revolution Changed the World. And he is also the co-author of Revolution Manifesto, Understanding Marx and Lenin's Theory of Revolution. Becker is a frequent contributor to the website Liberation News. He is the Western Regional Coordinator of the Answer Coalition. Becker is also a member of the Peace and Freedom State Central Committee and a representative of the Gloria La Riva for Governor 2018 campaign. So, and he will be back soon. Unless he fleed, I don't know. Okay,
No, you left his stuff here.
yeah, I'm just kidding. Okay, so I will just give the panel description, and then I guess we'll start this way, and hopefully Richard will be there in 20 minutes or so. So here's the panel description for this panel, Second Amendment on the left. Recent school shootings and the ever-reoccurring instances of police brutality pose acutely the question of gun control today. Should the left take up the demand for gun control? And if so, how? If not, why not? How is gun control related to the struggle for socialism? So, yeah, so I guess we will start with Ursula.
Okay. I'm having a hard time to even consider people having a position that doesn't condemn the shootings. I just can't imagine how far left you have to be to say there is something right about that. And of course, News and Letters Committee stands with the youth that challenge as their right to live, their ability to go to school, to have a reasonable life, that is not unseemly, that is not unrevolutionary. So, part of what speaks well of the youth is they recognize that while a shooting in an affluent society like Parkland, Florida, is rare, They also speak for curbing violence in minority neighborhoods where shootings are not rare. They're actually part of everyday events, so that the demand for ceasing the unending violence is not just their individual lives, but it's actually a human demand for everyone, every child's right, every youth's child. So what I see the youth is that they are opposing what this society produces. And what this society produces is greater and greater alienation from our human essence, from who we are as human beings. Accumulation of capital substitutes for all other expressions of our humanity. It cuts us off from experiencing ourselves as human beings. Whether it was that young man in Canada, do people remember that? A couple of years ago, a young man went on a shooting spree in a college in Canada, shooting mostly women students because, and he admitted it openly, they weren't agreeing to be laid by him, so they had to die. It was just straight up sexism. There was no question that here was a frustrated young white male who was going to take it out on the world because he couldn't get what he thought he deserved. Whether it's that one woman or the most recent week of now I have yours.
I'm sorry, I don't.
So we're going to go.
Thing in Houston, Santa Fe.
Yeah, from Santa Fe, whom his friends, and it's varied, but there were some reports on the news that described him as alienated. This is what capitalism produces. Frustrated young men who assert their right, their machismo, as a right to kill others. That's what capitalism produces. The worship of commodity and commodity accumulation results in more and more severe alienation and more immiseration. That's straight up Marx, contradiction in capital. So, the fact that this greater and greater alienation is at the bottom of the shootings is pretty obvious. And there were some things that came out yesterday that said, is it really a big mystery? According to Josh Marshall in Talking Points memo, it's not really much of a mystery. A shocking statistic that came up in Washington Post yesterday was that the number of deaths in school shootings this year is higher than the number of deaths among military personnel. So fighting the wars anywhere is actually less dangerous and less lethal than being a student in the US. It's kind of, the article was called 2018 has been deadlier for school children than service members. If you want to look it up, you have to kind of get the actual thing. So, as opposed to the do-nothing politicians, the youth did act. And I brought some copies of News and Letters. We have a report from the March 24th march in Oakland. That was the March for Our Lives. And I'll just quote a little bit of it. While promising to hold politicians accountable, the youth did not align with any political tendency, but focused on results. At stake in all this is the militarization of the mind in all relations, between states, individuals, states, and society, and especially poor immigrants and blacks. One student asked, why is an inanimate thing more important than human life? The National Rifle Association is not about the right to self-protection, but is in the forefront of the militarization of human relations. They have aligned with military arms manufacturers who want to unload their surplus to anyone in the civilian population with cash. All relations are now increasingly militarized. Can the struggle for new relations in the classrooms, in homes, on the streets, in workplaces be the new determinant of the future? Marxist revolution and permanence was never more relevant in standing for the self-expanding, never-ending idea of recognizing one's and the other's humanity in freely determining everyday activity. This is not alone about making a revolution versus elections as the goal of the movement. It goes beyond any stagification to transcending thingness in all its facets. Now, for me, sitting here, we're talking about Second Amendment, it's not a matter of gun control. Of course, the youth who kill as many as they can would be able to do much less damage if they were wielding a knife instead of a gun, like the student from Parkland said. But the point to me is that it's not enough to minimize the damage. That what we really want, while this would be a good first step and an assertion of the youth's power as opposed to the political and military machine, that passing gun laws is not enough. No law is ever enough. At best, laws are a reflection of where we are. They're not drivers of anything. They're not determinants of everything. Without a movement behind it, even the best laws can, and in fact are, and I can give lots of examples, transformed into their opposite. So the question is never this or that law, like Second Amendment. From the beginning, the US Constitution did not live up to the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. It enshrined slavery, counting blacks as 3/5 men for the purpose of giving more power to the slave owners. It wasn't even that the 3/5 were going to count as men, it was just for the purpose of giving slave owners more power. And a big part of the reason for the Second Amendment was that for whites to be able to keep the blacks enslaved, just look at the stuff that Jefferson wrote. They saw race war coming. And they wanted to make sure that whites were going to win that war. It was going to be one or the other. And that was the reason for making sure that they had arms. Okay. The power of the movement is that it starts with whatever reality is at hand. We don't pick the issues, so to speak. During the 60s, the civil rights movement did use guns successfully in several instances. And I don't know if people remember, probably not the younger people, but when Black Panthers went to Sacramento with guns and they stood on the steps, that created an image that really fired people up. It's not that they shut up anybody.
You got 2 minutes or shoot.
Oops, I better. Okay. Other instances, Negroes with guns. Jean organized a talk that presented the book by Robert Williams. He was a World War II veteran who, during the Civil Rights Movement, organized a way of protecting black children who were integrating a pool. So, there is another very good book called Negroes and the Gun, the Black Tradition of Arms. And I have a little bit of a quote from it, but I'm not going to go into it. Even Martin Luther King said in 1959, all societies, from the most primitive to the most cultured and civilized, accept as moral and legal violence exercised in self-defense. So violence exercised in self-defense is moral and legal. It's not like the spokesman for nonviolence will stock up no violence ever for any reason. The principle of self-defense, even involving weapons and bloodshed, has never been condemned. This is King continuing. Even by Gandhi, who sanctioned it for those unable to master pure nonviolence. So the question for the left cannot be support Second Amendment or not. It's not a question of laws. The question for me is always getting to a new society that finally overcomes the alienation that produces broken individuals like those shooters. They're also victims in some way. They're not just evil doers. The question is always one of ideology, that ideas that guide us and inform our everyday actions. Of course, I stand with the youth who challenge the rights of a thing as surplus commodity produced as a part of capitalist war machine sold to anyone with cash. Because capitalism is failing, its ideology disintegrates and degenerates and becomes more and more violent as they have less and less moral arguments. Capitalism will not be overcome by the power of guns. It can only be overcome by us organizing ourselves based on recognizing each other as full human beings.
Thank you. And
Okay, jumping right in. There's very little that you said that I disagree with, and especially the conclusion. I mean, the goal of Marxists needs to be to overcome the society, overcome the alienation of the society. But I think that's where we need to pick this question up. The question poses, should the left or the Marxists take up the demand for gun control? And how is this related to socialism? So for that, I think the answer really needs to be no. Marxists should not get involved with this notion that we need to have gun control. And this is for a pretty simple reason, I think. There's this argument made that the availability of guns in this country is what leads to mass shootings. And that's a pretty mechanical argument. You know, there are guns, so there's shootings overall. But if you look at the sort of legal firearm ownership patterns across the country, the U.S. is per capita the highest. It is concentrated in fewer hands in most places that have a lot of guns, but it is per capita the highest. Every other country on that list, though, and there's a gap. There's about 87 guns per 100, being the U.S. Is furthest ahead. I think Switzerland is 47 guns per citizen. I might be slightly off on that number, but you don't hear of Swiss mass shootings, and there needs to be an explanation for that. I mean, if we're taking an approach where we're a liberal argument essentially that guns equal mass shootings, we need to really probe this, and the answer is pretty clear to that we're in a period of capitalist decay. Of course, Switzerland is also a capitalist country, so is the United States, but in this period of capitalist decay, the sort of social problems that we're seeing in decaying, sort of failing capitalism are different in different countries. So you don't really see this pronounced gun violence in other countries, even with the availabilities of guns. So the real thing we need to point towards is that this is the problem we're looking at is the problem of a decaying capitalism, of a capitalism that's more abundant, no longer able to produce increase the means of production. Ultimately, Marxists look at the economic base of things, and from my perspective, at least, from the perspective of my tendency, that capitalism since World War I, that period on, any progressive aspect of it, you could say, is done. There's nothing progressive at all coming out of it. You even see this in culture and society in general. If you look at even mass media today, it's just a reproduction of the movies of the 80s and before. There's very little new sort of culture that's coming out at a mass level. This is another indication of society being in decay, and it is related in some limited sense to this phenomenon of mass shootings that we're seeing, where some young people are lashing out and committing mass murders. And this is not unique in history. You'll see this across societies that are in periods of decay. These sort of mass shootings erupt, or mass violence like this erupt. But the questions we need to also look at are, how does gun control relate to the struggle for socialism? So from the Marxist perspective, the state is an instrument of class oppression. All class society has had a state. They were kind of joined that way. And this class society, the entire function of the state is to perpetuate private property, safeguard private property, and to do so with violent means when necessary. Ultimately, we need to forcibly take take power across the world. And this is not a defense of individual terrorism. It's not a defense of any sort of guerrillas tactics. But that is a component of socialist revolution, is that you need to overthrow the capitalist state by creating a worker state, which is essentially a non-state. So instead of having a few number of people armed and having prisons and a bureaucracy on top of that, so a socialist revolution, as Engels theorized and Lenin theorized, really is about the mass of people taking power. And that does include an element of them being armed. And of course, we shouldn't overgeneralize this. There's a relationship between guns and revolution, but we shouldn't fetishize the gun either. Ultimately, this is a political question, and the revolution itself is one. The gun part is just one component of it. It's an auxiliary. The primary task of socialists is to promote and spread Marxist ideas and socialist ideas, so that they have that the masses actually grasp them. But at the same time, if you look at the history of the Russian Revolution, if you read Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution in particular, he talks about one incident where there is the workers cross the river, and there's a brigade of the Tsar's military standing in front of them. And a worker shot one bullet at an officer that was disciplining a number of soldiers, holding them back from a major advance in the revolution on the ground. And that one bullet changed the entire situation. I think that's a really good sort of analogy of understanding the sense of proportion we have to have about this. There shouldn't be any call for massive violence either. Now, the entire point of this, though, is to relate it back to the youth movement that you described. So I think we need to understand the contradictions in that movement as well. It clearly is, if you look at Chicago in particular, and even the East Bay, the youth that have come out aren't raising simply demands about gun control. They're raising social demands about wanting quality education, about wanting a different kind of society. But the contradiction to that is that you do have the Democrat Party establishment, which is a capitalist party. You have elements of the FBI and the state deeply involved with running the shots here, controlling thing here. There's also misconception of these rallies nationally. They weren't really purely led by youth. That's what was getting screen time and play in the capitalist media. But to some degree, there are elements of the capitalist state and the Democrat Party that are involved with this. And that relates back to what you said about this really isn't our fight to try to change the Second Amendment. Ultimately, the Constitution doesn't matter to Marxists. We're not making a constitutional argument for why workers should be armed. We think they should be armed because it's politically what we believe. But this idea of changing and reforming the Constitution, it's a safety valve to kind of let heat dissipate. You can see this in a number of movements that are taking place across the world right now. It's not just about the gun rights issue. In other countries, there are other major constitutional issues or constitutional clauses that are being used now to deflate and divert large movements that are taking place. So we really should reconsider the question. The question isn't should the Marxists take position or demand gun control, but it really should be what is the relationship of gun control and workers, not the left in gun control, but workers in gun control. And I think it should be clear that Marxists need to stand for the democratic rights of workers and particularly the oppressed layer. And gun control always boils down to, in practice, denying gun rights. I disagree with one part. I don't think the Second Amendment was about continuing slavery. There's a lot of contradictions in there. In fact, it's gun control that tends to be racist. If you look at how gun control really took off, it was after the Black Panthers went to Sacramento that the NRA switched from being a lobby for more gun control to a lobby against gun control. It was a reaction to Reagan coming in and working with the NRA to block the gun rights for people here. Now, that wasn't directed towards some sort of white reactionaries. The panic that existed was an oppressed racial group in this country was connecting with communist ideas and had the audacity to actually arm themselves. And I think Marxists should defend the gun rights of oppressed layers in particular. The NRA won't. Philando Castile was killed. The NRA didn't say a thing. So we need to be clear about this part, at least, that the gun rights of workers are democratic rights. They're applied democratic rights in general, including the right to life. are applied unequally in the society, and Marxists need to protect these rights. But this is a complicated thing, though, with the movement for gun control. There is that kernel of some progressive or sort of socialist thought in that, even with section of the workers when they're youth when they're coming out, they're raising social demands. Our task is to connect to those social demands and not really get caught up in the gun debate too much. One thing I do want to emphasize is, again, guns are an auxiliary question. They're not the main question here. The real question is which class rules, and sure, they use guns to do that. No one should be advocating guerrilla war, but to forfeit our own rights as a response to, and a lot of these shooters are fascists, some of them at least. The response to a fascist killing a bunch of kids should not be to surrender our own rights.
Thank you, Cavern. Richard Becker, yeah, we're doing 10 minutes, and
Okay.
I'll just raise my hand when you have 2 minutes left with a little 2.
Okay.
So yeah.
I'm speaking today on behalf of Gloria La Riva, who is listed on the flyer as the Peace and Freedom Party candidate for governor of California. Gloria is also a leading member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And there's some literature over on the table that we brought that people are welcome to take. I'll just read a paragraph from the Peace and Freedom Party platform. Peace and Freedom Party calls for the defense and extension of the liberties guaranteed in the Bill of Rights, including freedom of speech, press, assembly, and association, and the right to keep and bear arms for individual and collective defense. The ultimate guarantee of those rights is the organized strength of the working class. Mass shootings are on the rise, dramatically so, in the United States. Almost 600 people were killed in mass shootings of this type in 2017, the highest number in modern history. People killed in mass shootings make up just a small fraction of gun deaths in the United States. Over 15,000 people in the United States were killed with guns in 2017. Over 20,000 committed suicide using a firearm. Black men are 4 times more likely to be shot and killed than white men. I'm just have some facts. Every 2 days, 3 women are killed with a gun by domestic violence in the United States. The police killed over 1,000 people in 2017. More people were killed by racist police, anti-working class police forces last year than in mass shootings. It's clear that the United States is an extremely violent country. Long ago, I briefly met H. Rap Brown, who's now known as Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, who made the famous quote that violence is as American as cherry pie. The U.S. is a much more violent country than any of the other industrially developed countries, and much more violent than many countries in what's called the developing world, much poorer countries. And every single statistic bears this out. People in the United States are 5 times as likely to be shot and killed with a firearm than in Croatia, 8 times as in Canada, 10 times as in Italy, 11 times as in Germany, 14 times as in Ireland, 50 times as likely in the United Kingdom, 200 times as likely, plus, it's actually higher than 200 times, in Japan. And police killing statistics are similarly skewed between the US and other countries in the world. And among developing countries, and this goes for many, many, but I just mentioned 2, you're 40 times more likely to be killed with a firearm in the United States than in India, and 55 times more likely than in Cuba. The U.S. ranked last year 15th in the world for gun homicides, the rate of gun homicides. Most of the countries ahead of the United States on the list are extremely poor and or victims of U.S. imperialist intervention. Among the top 5 are Guatemala, El Salvador, and at the very top of the list for murders worldwide, anyone want to take a venture a guess?
Mexico.
No.
Oh,
Honduras, where the U.S. carried out the coup, supported the coup in 2009, and which sent Honduras in this downward spiral that has not stopped. Overwhelmingly, the mass killings in the United States have been committed by extreme right-wing or fascistic white men. Not all, but the big majority of those, although the media steers us away from that understanding and of calling them terrorists. The U.S. has the distinction of being number one by far in gun-related suicides and by far in guns, with 101.5 guns for every 100 people. That's the latest statistic there. Violence, and particularly gun violence, is a social problem of considerable magnitude, and the capitalist ruling class has provided no substantive answers to the millions who are demanding something be done, particularly young people. It is insufficient for us as socialists, just because we oppose the capitalist state having a monopoly of force, to say, quote, nothing can be done, unquote. In fact, the United States, as I think most people here know, was founded on violence, on extreme violence. Native genocide and slavery are not errors that happened in the past, but the very cornerstone of and foundation of capitalism in the United States. The Second Amendment was actually added to the Bill of Rights as a license for racist vigilante militias with the overt and covert backing of the United States government to carry out a reign of terror against native populations. Slave patrols, which are the origin really of police forces in the United States, which first came into being in the first decade of the 1700s in South Carolina, carried out unspeakable atrocities. They were kind of like the forerunners also, not only of the modern racist police, but of the Ku Klux Klan. And carried out these atrocities against the black population as a matter of routine in the enforcement of slavery. Of course, enslaved people would be severely punished if found in the possession of firearms, or actually of any weapon. After slavery ended formally, the black codes across the South forbade black people from possessing firearms. And when it was mentioned, the Black Panther Party powerfully exercised the right to bear arms. The California state legislature rapidly changed the law to criminalize that practice, which was legal at the time, with, as the other speakers have said, with the NRA support. Philando Castile, a school employee exercising his right to carry a weapon under Minnesota law, and who said that he was carrying a weapon, was nevertheless killed on the spot when he announced to a police officer that he had a gun. And again, the NRA did nothing about that. Tamir Rice, after playing with a toy gun, was instantly murdered by a Cleveland officer, and Ohio is an open carry state. In other words, even if he had been carrying, if Tamir Rice hadn't been carrying a toy rifle, but a real rifle, what he was doing was legal. And I don't know if anybody here remembers the case of Andy Lopez in Santa Rosa. This is 2013, 12-year-old boy in the Roseland section, the South, mainly Latino section of Santa Rosa, walking with a toy gun. Police officer pulled up, the police car pulled up, the police officer in the passenger seat jumped out of the car, and within 4 seconds, shot Andy Lopez in the chest here. So he said he feared for his life. He actually wrote a column before that. He had a website saying, if you ever kill a kid by mistake, just say, I feared for my life. That's what he said, and he got off. The bullet went from here through the heart and lungs of this 12-year-old boy and came to rest there. So in other words, he had turned about this far toward the police when the police opened fire. The fact that the police forces to this day murder Native and black people at a much higher rate than white people is not a coincidence. It's not possible to separate institutional and violent racism from the social and political character of the US state. Capitalism is violent, imperialism is violent. Everywhere you look in the culture of the United States, you see violence. And it sells too. While the manufacturing industries have declined in the United States in general, weapons and guns production have skyrocketed. The US produces, exports, and sells more weapons than the rest of the world, subsidized, of course, by the largest military budget in world history, in meaning subsidized by us. The weapons industry thrives on war, but has branched out from selling excess military-grade weaponry to local police departments and individuals, has now flourished into a vast civilian market. We should really view the NRA, by the way, as the lobbying arm of the gun industry. It recruits a lot of people on another basis, defending so-called gun rights, but in reality, that's what it is. It's there to, its main function is to protect the military industry, the gun industry. To wrap up, I was trying to say that, how much time do I have left?
2 minutes.
Okay, to wrap up, I just want to say this. No one wants to hear politicians talk about prayers anymore. As a matter of fact, they kind of know that, and they have realized that we got to shut up about that. And the existing terms of the gun violence debate, gun control versus gun rights, is extremely superficial and inadequate to the complexity of the problem. To put it succinctly, under the capitalist system, neither gun control nor gun access has guaranteed people's safety or protected their rights. Just to say quickly some of the things that we think needs to be done. Demilitarize the police and state, as the first point. Demilitarize the school, no arming of teachers. And the protection of the gun makers from lawsuits. Fully fund violence interruption, conflict resolution, and other social work programs as a national priority. Build strong, empowered working class youth and neighborhood community organizations, which I think would be a very key point. Required proof of training in shooting and gun safety, similar to that which is required to drive legally. Black, Latino, Native, and other oppressed peoples must have the unconditional right to self-determination and self-defense. Above all, what we need is the socialist reorganization of society. Only when a new system and a new state that truly serves the interests of the working class and all who are oppressed under capitalism can we engage in a serious discussion of the issues of guns in the context of overcoming the extreme alienation that characterizes the present system and which is the critical underlying factor in the epidemic of mass killing. Cuba, which has been threatened for nearly 60 years by the US, guns have not disappeared. In fact, nearly the entire population is trained on how to use guns. But those guns are safely stored in each community, and local organizations stand ready to distribute them as necessary. Gun violence by police or individuals is virtually non-existent in Cuba. When I've talked to police in Cuba about that, and they kind of look at you like, what are you talking about? So, I'll stop.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry about that noise. So now we'll have the panelists respond to one another, and yes, for about like 3 to 4 minutes each. I'll just give you guys like the 1 minute sign at 3 minutes, and then afterwards we'll open it up for questions. So, Ursula?
Okay. Well, it seems to me that the main difference between me and perhaps both speakers is that they're saying we should not enter this gun debate, whereas I'm saying we should support the youth in what their demands are, but not be limited to the first expression of those demands as gun control, and rather make it really clear that what's involved is changing the whole society, that where they're coming from is a much deeper question than just gun control would answer. But I am absolutely for supporting the youth who are saying gun control is our issue, because it stems from assertion of their humanity and how they want to relate to each other. And I think part of the failure of the left is coming up with a program that says this is what a revolution is, and if you don't live up to it, you're not revolutionary, forget you. And that was part of civil rights movement. Well, what's civil rights? It's just a paper, right? It's recognition by bourgeois state. It means nothing, but it did. It changed the world, and people participated in it because they saw something important to themselves, to expressing their humanity in it. And yes, it got deflected into the Civil Rights Act, and it's now being turned into its opposite, but it doesn't deter from the fact that we start from wherever we are, and the focus that a Marxist group, in my opinion, should have is to encourage these beginnings, however they arise, to bloom to a questioning of the whole society, and how do we finally get beyond this stupid state issue idea that somehow we have to be organized as a state and get to a society that's organized around affirming and creating not commodities, but our humanity.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with, I think, where the panel might differ a little. I also don't think that this is really a case of the demands of the youth as some sort of monolith. Again, in certain areas, when they were going out in the streets, they were raising social demands that went beyond the gun question. That was not even an important question in many locations. And there is an element of the Democrat Party establishment and the state that was involved with these protests, or at least controlling these protests. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because if we look at how society is functioning, when Lenin described the objective conditions of revolution, one of the conditions of that revolution is that the ruling class is split and unable to rule in the old way as it did before. That situation isn't something that gradually happens mechanically. It is sort of a phase shift when it does arise. Everything is different, but there's certain hints you can see of a split in the ruling class from time to time. This is one of those cases. There are sections of the ruling class that have different interests. In the South, for instance, where there's a more strong gun culture, you could say it's on the basis of the land-owning class wanting to control land and the legacy that's had. In areas like this, you could say the petty bourgeois layers and even the capitalists have an interest in a strong police and a weak population in terms of access to gun control, because that's their preferred way of continuing the rule of private property in these areas. This is essentially a debate between two factions of the ruling class. Our task is different. Our task is to make sure that we have the working class in power. Now, the gun question is a minor part of it. The real important part is building a class struggle, international revolutionary organization that's able to overthrow capitalism across the world. The real task is that under certain conditions, we would want to arm. I don't think you'll disagree with this. I think that arming the teachers, as in teachers when they're in school, is ridiculous. But arming workers under certain conditions could be necessary. If we saw a minor little fascist threat in the previous period, if that was a mass sort of phenomenon coming up, Marxists should be advocating at that point arming the workers' organizations, including teachers' unions, but not obviously in school. So the real question posed to us is one of reform or revolution. We can't get derailed by this sort of harbinger of a split in the ruling class by siding with the left faction of that, instead of putting forward an independent class position.
Well, we have a flyer, NRA called Student Protest Socialist, they did. And then the flyer is what do socialists really stand for? And a lot of it is the program that I just was talking about. And people are welcome to take a copy of that. So, and we went to many of the student marches and different demonstrations around the country. So it's not that we're unsympathetic to what the students are demanding and to the student movement. We don't agree with everything that people are saying. I don't think they agree with everything that all of them are saying. I think that there's some differences of opinion there. So I wanted to just mention the Greensboro Massacre. Do people here remember the Greensboro Massacre? It was in 1979. It was in Greensboro, North Carolina. And the Communist Workers' Party, which was a Maoist party, but they gained a lot of influence in North Carolina and in the unions and so forth. And in the South, there's a tradition that if you had a picket line, you had somebody who's there with a shotgun. And it was accepted that that's how it was. So they called an anti-Klan demo. The Klan was there. And the police, they talked to the police, and the police convinced them not to have the person with the shotgun at this particular demonstration. And they had the demonstration, a car full of Klansmen pulled up, they opened the trunk very deliberately, took out the rifles, and killed 5 of them, and wounded others. You know, we can't accept that. You know, if the fascists are gonna come to demonstrations with guns, and they stabbed 9 people in Sacramento at an anti-Klan, anti-Nazi demo that I was at in June of 2016. You know, we have to be realistic about it. We have to, and self-defense means you have to have self-defense at the level of the threat. Otherwise, you don't really have self-defense. It's like people used to say, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. I mean, I'm not in favor of gunfights. but you can see where that goes. So and as the program that I stated, and I said a lot of things very fast, so I urge people to pick this up. The statistics about the world aren't in here, but the necessity of self-defense, and this went for the civil rights movement too. I agree with that. The chief security officer for Martin Luther King was asked one time by a reporter, what about the .38 you're carrying? And he said, oh, it's my, what about the gun you're carrying? He said, oh, it's my special nonviolent .38. King had to be defended. King was under constant threat. So King wasn't advocating, and I think this is the tactics that King was advocating, and we could discuss them in regards to, in relation to other tactics, but those were tactics. Those were the tactics of nonviolence, but at the same time, there was always a realism that you had to have security at a level that was equal to the threat against you.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So we are now going to open it up for questions. Just a heads up, we will be taking one question at a time. Not every panelist has to respond to every question, but we do like to take one question at a time to focus the conversation. And so, yeah, any questions? Okay, go with Ron.
Well, what I want to know is about the mass slaughter of civilians in the Syrian revolution. Syrians who came out day after day en masse trying to live freely in their own country and were hit with barrel bombs and everything else on a scale that matches any other scale of genocidal mass slaughter of innocent people. And all these other state forces got involved. But where's the idea of revolution and self-determination in that endeavor? Why has the left suddenly let that get lost and get buried? And everything is just one actor on the world when there's a lot of actors on the world, whether it's ISIS or Putin, that are into using mass violence against civilians. So the question to me is it's kind of a kind of hypocrisy to not even to confront that. I mean, I would suggest everyone read Saleh's book on A Witness to This Unfolding Revolution. He's a Marxist. He spent 2 decades in jail under Assad, and it just came out. And I just can't see how the left in this country can have a one-note concept of revolution and self-determination and not have a universal humanist concept that relates to these human beings who explicitly call themselves humanists. What happened to our humanity?
Okay, so whoever wants to address that first, or?
Well, I think you're echoing the line of the State Department, to be quite frank, and of the New York Times and the Washington Post, the leading imperialist voices about what's going on in Syria. And if we look at what's happened, if we really look at what's happened over the last 15 years, to Iraq, which was invaded and torn apart, and what was the pretense for that? It was, number one, that they had weapons of mass destruction, and number two, they were Saddam Hussein violated human rights. None of that meant anything to the people who carried out the invasion. The US and the British, the former colonizers of the region and the modern colonizers of the region. And Iraq is not one country anymore. It was torn to pieces. 2011, Libya. We were told in the United States that there had to be intervention by the US and NATO because Muammar Gaddafi was giving Viagra and amphetamines to his troops, and they were about to engage in mass rape and mass murder, unless we intervene now. That was the line. That was the predominant line in the United States. And so now Libya is not one country anymore either. It's torn to pieces. And it's gone from being the country that had the highest standard of living in Africa to being a country where every day thousands of people are getting in rickety boats and thousands of them are dying in the Mediterranean Sea trying to make it to Europe because they cannot live anymore in Libya. So now we're supposed to swallow the propaganda that comes from Washington that says Assad is the greatest criminal, Assad must go, Assad is genocidal. You know, do you know how many of the people, the casualties in Syria are actually Syrian soldiers? I mean, this is not a peaceful revolt that was going on or a peaceful revolution. This was spearheaded by the most reactionary forces. And at the beginning there were demonstrations, but at the beginning there was also violence. And no state is going to allow itself to be destroyed without trying to fight back against it. Syria, fortunately, has not been completely destroyed, but it's in pieces as well. And being in pieces is good for imperialism. It makes it easier, more digestible pieces, easier to consume the natural resources when they don't have to deal with an actual state.
So I don't think the comrade mentioned anything about Iraq or Libya, so I'm not quite sure how anyone can allege that they're representing the State Department line on Iraq or Libya. Concretely, about Syria, all that was said was a critique of the Assad regime. I believe you're coming from a global class struggle sort of hypothesis from Sam Marcy, which we can talk about later, but I think ultimately that looks at the relation of states instead of actually understanding class struggle as an independent phenomenon. You could say at the early stage, at least from what we could tell with the fog of war from the outside, that there were certain elements in Syria that were historically progressive, that were even communist. Right now, from what we can tell from the outside through the fog of war, at least to the extent of my understanding, I can't identify under the current circumstances any such force there personally. But that's neither here nor there. The entire point that I'm trying to make here is not every critique of a dictatorship abroad is a State Department line. This sort of idea that everything that is a critique of not relating well with the American State Department is in favor of the American State Department has led tendencies to call the Taliban an anti-imperialist force. I'm Pashtun, by the way. The Pashtun people have been replaced by the Taliban. I don't buy that line. And that's come from Workers' World, it's come from PSL, and is pretty consistent with the argument that I'm hearing from the comrade. So I don't believe the comrade that asked the question was echoing the State Department line. I think it was a pretty legitimate question. But we're talking about an area where the fog of war makes it difficult to come up with any sort of categorical statements about what, if any, forces that are not the Assad regime are in any way progressive. But this doesn't mean that Marxists should start supporting the Assad regime. I think, again, an independent class struggle position is what we should take. And this doesn't mean always siding with or trying to find anti-imperialists in Assad or the Taliban or various militias that have popped up across the world. That's just, I don't know.
So just very briefly, it is my experience, having lived in several countries, that there are two worlds in each country. In every country, in every state, there is the ruling class, such as Assad in Syria or Trump in US, and then there are people that are ruled by them and ruled by the ruling ideology. And in every country where there is the opposition to their own rulers, I don't care what the State Department says. That's not my definition of whether you're revolutionary or not. If you're supporting a movement against your own rulers, that's where a revolution starts. That's where it has to start. That's what I want to support. To use State Department as a measuring stick is to give up Marxism and turn over definition of who we are to the State Department.
Yep.
It's completely ridiculous.
Thank you, Pat. So open up to questions. Eugene, you had your hand up.
Okay, I want to get in there. I appreciate discussion. I think it's very important. And I just think back to what my comrade Cindy Sheehan said about this. And she was a former Peace and Freedom Party gubernatorial candidate in 2014, I believe. Yeah. But she said gun control should begin with the Pentagon. And I think that's a very crucial statement because, we need to understand how militarism, just penetrates every aspect of our society. When they propose a new weapons system, for example, they make sure they parcel it out. Parts are made in every state in the union, and if possible, every congressional district in the union, and the lobbyists are supporting every, political candidate they can. So this permeates the very basis of our society. And not only that, kids are going to ROTC in their high schools or middle schools. We have all this militarism permeating the society. And this whole business about all this talk, which I support, about peace in Korea. There's a lot. All the mainstream media acts as if the United States nukes are legitimate. That somehow the United States has a right to have these nuclear weapons, and Korea, no other country does, which I think is just sick. But I also want to say about the Peace and Freedom Party platform is that I'm sure Jake and myself and Cindy all support. And the platform says that we, first of all, we're against militarism. All U.S. troops should come home. The CIA should be abandoned. The national security state should be abandoned, and so forth. All of these things about our militarism should just be cut dead, and there should be no more of this war production. And again, how we implement that's another question, and I'd like to hear from our speakers how they would implement this if they think it's a good idea.
All right. Any takers?
You need a revolution to implement that to disarm the Pentagon. You need a world revolution to get rid of states in the first place. But yeah, it's a great goal.
I agree with him.
Richard, or you want to?
Yeah, I have to say, in regard to something that was said though a minute ago, that I don't know where the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, has ever expressed support for the Taliban. That's a slander. What we have supported is the right of the people of Afghanistan to determine their own future. And the same thing goes for Syria. And the myth about Syria that, it's the people versus the regime is a complete myth. And that's another one that's been perpetrated on us. Really, there was an election, actually, in the middle of this war. And people can ridicule it if they want to, but that in Lebanon, there was no question that of the million people who in Lebanon, there were huge demonstrations. They didn't have to do it. They're in Lebanon. They're not even in Syria. They're refugees there in support of Assad. Understanding that the alternative in Syria, and I'm not actually sure why we're talking about Syria and the gun control argument, but since it's been brought up, I think we have to address it, that the alternative is not some shiny, democratic, third way socialist, revolutionary socialists who are about to take over in Syria. That's not it. What it was going to be was something like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and a number of other organizations, quite a few organizations that have exactly the same ideology but have different regional bases. So that's what the alternative is. So you can choose the alternative. It's ridiculous on the left in the U.S. and a lot of the world where this mythical third way exists when in fact it doesn't. And both communist parties in Syria have stood with the government, and they have criticisms of the government. I've been to Syria a couple times. But that's the reality.
Yeah, I'd just like to directly respond to that too. I'm not a proponent of third way politics. There is no third way. It's either socialism or it's for capitalism. What I'm not a proponent of is obscuring class struggle and focusing only on the relationships between states and being so focused on what the State Department's saying that we blur together any sort of resistance against local, even essentially bourgeois regimes that are oppressing people. The idea that the Communist Party in Syria supported Assad, therefore he's got his red credentials, we can give him a pair of red wings. The Communist Party in Pakistan supported the Ayub Khan dictatorship in '68 against the revolution that was taking place. The communist parties across the world have betrayed the people repeatedly. So that's no badge of honor to say that it's validating anything. And by the way, concretely speaking, currently I don't see any progressive forces fighting Assad on the ground in Syria. There is a fog of war. Don't know. I'm not saying we should be supporting any of them, but to allege that anyone that's asking a question about them, and that was a slander to the comrade, that somehow he's representing some sort of State Department socialism is a slander.
And he wasn't asking a question. He was making a very clear position.
And he was.
It wasn't a question.
He expressed his opinion, and to slander it, to say that any critique of Assad is State Department socialism, is fixating on the relationship between states and not on actual class struggle that is taking place across the world. And the idea that the support for the Taliban is not something the PSL has done. I've seen articles in Workers' World and the PSL paper that critically support the Taliban as some sort of anti-imperialist force.
That's a lie.
Okay, well we can debate that later, but
That's not true. That's a falsification. Can you
Well,
cite one?
I'm not sitting here, but yeah.
Okay, well, we'll just move on to the next question. So anybody, or Ian, yeah.
I think it's kind of similar to Nikki's question, but I was curious because in the actual language of the Second Amendment, it talks about militia, and I know it was sort of like cold, full socialist party took this up from the Republican tradition that comes from that's in the Second Amendment that they supported people's militias as opposed to standing armies. And I'm curious because that was like a debate with Ingalls about people's militias or standing armies that are anachronistic to take up that kind of perspective. So yeah, I'm curious what panelists think about that debate. Like, is the idea of people's militia just like, a historical note, or is that actually something that can be taken up in a social program to oppose the concept of standing armies, or is that actually, you have to join the standing army split? That was like the Ingalls view.
Well,
So
go
where
ahead.
I'm stuck. My position is that everything begins and ends with the human being, right? So when we look at who, not what, who constitutes the U.S. Army, it's primarily people of color. If you get to the point like the Iranian Revolution did, or the Russian Revolution, since we're celebrating the 100th anniversary, where the soldiers are coming to the side of the revolution because they see their liberation not in following orders, but in establishing a different order, then the question of army versus militia is kind of moot. It happened in Egypt a little bit. It didn't develop in a revolution, but the beginnings were there where the soldiers were saying, we're not going to shoot on people, we're not going to go into Tahrir Square and just massacre everyone. So the question of who is much more important to unfolding a revolutionary potential than a what, like a gun or whatever weapons.
Well, I think the question is, what's the purpose of the militia? In Cuba, the purpose of the militia is to provide an auxiliary, and the militias are very, very big. The civilian militia, people have a minimum amount of training. Some have more training because they've been through the military, but it's a defense mechanism against. It's part of the defense of Cuba, the Cuban Revolution against U.S. imperialism. The purpose of the militias early on in the United States was something completely different. There had to be some way by which the native and the indigenous people were dispossessed of their land. They generally were not going voluntarily. They were either killed or they were threatened with death or to move and wiped out to a very large degree. So in California, for instance, between 1848, when the discovery of gold took place, and 1865, 17 years, 90% of the population was wiped out. That was actually a New York Times story, so it may have been more than 90%. But how were they were massacred by militias, basically. I mean, they couldn't just be, one or two people went out and started shooting, they'd get killed. There had to be organized groups. And so the militias played a very important role, and not just in California, but in the eastern part of the United States in the earlier period when the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was adopted.
An army is a special body of our men. It's at the very core of the state. Militia, more broadly outside the U.S. Context, or outside the context of an auxiliary force, which really becomes a paramilitary. The Cuban militias are essentially a paramilitary, auxiliary to the military. But a militia is, beyond that, historically, was always understood to be the general armed population. Not everybody, but general armed population, as counterposed to the state. I think, to answer your question, which one's more relevant, I don't know. We'd have to look at it concretely. If concretely in a country there's a socialist revolution taking place and a section of the armed forces is a split, it should, the workers' movement should organize it. But I think the real question here is one of the state withering away and not a permanent state. Because if we're Marxists, we do believe in communism, not socialism as a form of a worker state, anything beyond a transitionary phase. So for that, we do need militias, and because they need to be the general armed body, and because the state, as it withers away, needs to have, it needs to be something. It can't just be the special armed body withers away, and then we're not idealists. It's not just going to evaporate in a poof. So some other body takes over the organization of society. There is a worker state. The healthiest form of the worker state is the physical coercive aspect of it is a workers' militia. That's the early Soviet Union as the best example you can think of. With that, there were sections of the Tsarist army breaking, but the Red Army essentially was a militia. It didn't have, in the early phase, any ranks beyond commander. So it was commander plus a function as a description, commander of a brigade, commander of something else. And it was, every village would actually elect people in the Red Army to be its officer. So there was a very radically democratic military force, not something you can compare to the American Army, for instance. I don't think what Richard's saying is actually incorrect about the U.S. history with militias being a completely different force, but that has that relates to the sort of society it was. This is a genocidal sort of society, which capitalism was born out of bloodshed and enslavement. So the militias served a different function, which was to, first of all, protect private property, and secondly, to expand. In this country, there wasn't really the need for very deep sort of theory either. This is one of the deficiencies in the left here, is we don't really have the same level of theoretical development as other countries' Marxist movements have, largely because, or the other countries' workers' movements have, largely because in this country it was a very pragmatic thing, just kill people, enslave people, and yes, the militias played a role in that, but that's a militia within a capitalist context. Within a socialist context, it has to be the general armed masses.
And for more on this question, perhaps tomorrow, because the Kurds have a very democratic armed forces that are especially dear to my heart because just out of very pragmatic reasons, they had to include women in the military forces, and it completely changed the social order and the thinking of the people about their own society. So we'll have more of a discussion about that tomorrow.
Thanks. All right, so more questions. I think, Rob, I saw your hand, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So my first question is because I was kind of confused with some of the words that were being used earlier, or I don't understand how they're being used. So the first, I guess it's a phrase more, is, what's your name?
Urszula, like Ursula.
Is there like an abbreviated version or a letter maybe?
Urla.
Ula is the Polish shortened version.
Is that satisfactory?
That is perfectly satisfactory.
All right.
As long as you're not a high school student.
Ula.
We're talking about Ula.
So early on in your introductory portion, or in your introduction, how do you say it? You use the phrase human essence. So I got caught on that. I'm like, I'm not entirely sure what is meant by that. And if what I'm thinking is correct, it makes me think that this is too arbitrary of a phrase to be used as a pillar for an argument. It's like, well, I can make the argument that, well, human essence is this, and your argument would be human essence is this, and like, how do we square these two different interpretations of human essence? So, just for some clarification.
I love this question. Human essence was the content of Marx's whole philosophy. And you can see an elaboration of it in 1844 manuscripts when he talks very specifically about what makes us human beings human. Mm-hmm. And it's everything hinges on what it means to be a full human being. And to Marx, that means freedom in our everyday activity. We don't have to fit ourselves into the job market. We experience our humanity as relations with others, and those relations reinforce in us who it is that we are. So it's what he gets out of Hegel, I don't know, is the I-we question. And what capitalism does is it completely splits it. So that I is an individual I, you are completely separated from anybody else, and you're a self-made millionaire. What a ridiculous idea. There is no such thing as a self-made millionaire. You can't make anything unless you're exploiting others. So there's no connection, no human connection in the I that's under capitalism. On the other hand, we the United States? The hell it is. I don't participate in that we, except that I do being a US citizen. So we is completely separate from I. And human essence is in understanding ourselves as social beings, as free social beings who determine who we are as a we. I, that's a we. And we, that's an I. Did that make any sense?
Yeah, but within your explanation, just another question popped up. I don't know, like, does anybody else, I don't want to like bogart the questions because I'm just full of them.
Just go for it, Rob.
Okay. So within your explanation, you mentioned there's no such thing as a self-made millionaire, and there's always at some point some form of exploitation. So my question along the lines of definition or defining exploitation. So does exploitation occur from a third party perspective? So you look at an agreement between two parties and say, well, this agreement, this person is getting a bad bargain for what they're getting, as opposed to the person who's within it. So a first person perspective of, I'm okay with this arrangement. So is the person who's okay with an arrangement being exploited? Or is a person being exploited if somebody from a third party, some third party views what's going on between these two parties who are making the agreement?
Well, that's a very basic Marxist question. And for Marx, we start with the production of commodities, right? And we all know what a commodity is. Commodity is a thing that's made for exchange, and it's an embodiment both of use value. There was coffee in there that was actually pretty useful to me. And an exchange value, which is the $3 or whatever I paid for it, right? So when a human being is viewed as a commodity and sells their labor time, that is an objective organization of society. That is not something that is strictly an agreement between the individuals. I go looking for a job because I have to live. So I accept whatever job I'm given because I have to make money to live. It's okay. I see when we live in a society in which you have to sell your labor power to live, that is exploitation because there is no way for that to be equitable. When some people own all the means of production and other people own nothing but their labor power, it doesn't matter how much they agree to the contract. It's not a matter of agreement. It is exploitation very objectively. And it's felt as a contradiction within the worker. Because on the one hand, I wanted to do something good, so I became a nurse. I haven't actually, but let's just pretend, right? And I wanted to provide health care to people who needed health care, and that's
Sure.
why I went into nursing. But what happens when I'm in the hospital that's in the business of collecting money and providing as little care as they can? And they assign me a patient load of 16 patients that I have no hope of being able to help within the confines of this. I experienced this difference between labor time as what I want to do with my life to contribute to society, and labor time as generating value for the hospital. And that's the way in which this exploitation is not just a matter of third party looking in, but it's an actual lived contradiction within a working person.
Can I take a minor crack at that too? And I'll keep it briefly.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, the key to understanding this is what is exploitation. It's your unpaid labor, right? So the only way that the capitalist profits, and this is really reducing it, but the only way the capitalist profits is not paying a worker their wage. That is the basis of the idea of alienation. So when Marx uses the term alienation, fundamentally he means in the legal sense of alienating you from something that belongs to you. And from there, Marx elaborates an understanding of what he called the species being. So it's not like Marx said there's no such thing as human nature. Marx did argue that human nature changes, part of it changes based off the society we live in. But there is a certain human species being, which is a creative being. And that's, he talked about how a human's different than a spider, where a spider could weave a web and not necessarily have a conception of something before it does it. Whereas a human, when a human creates, when an architect, when they create, first they create that in some sort of abstractness, and then take that abstractness and make it concrete through labor. So yeah, it's a sort of difficult concept to explain briefly, but this is linking exploitation and alienation and species being.
Well, let's let Richard get a crack at that.
Yeah,
Since,
I mean,
everyone else-
in this enslaved system, exploitation was very clear, right?
Mhm.
The owner exploited the slave got nothing except sustenance, the benefit all went. Under feudalism, the feudal lord took 60% of what you grew if you were a serf, a peasant serf, and that was clearly exploitation, right?
Sure.
So under capitalism, it's hidden, and one of the things is that Marx discovered how the process of exploitation takes place, and that all workers are exploited. I mean, like people will say, I got a good job, I'm making $20 an hour, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're only making $20 an hour because the boss who hired you, particularly in the private sector, is making more, you're producing more value for that company than they are paying you.
Right.
And so there's an inherent exploitation in the capitalist relations of production between the owner and the worker. So all workers are exploited.
So, oh my bad, I'm almost.
Well, let's just move on to our questions,
Yeah.
because we want to get on the Second Amendment and its relation to left and socialism. So I'm going to go with Adam, and since we only have 25 minutes left, we'll go with Adam, and then after they address it, then we'll have Audrey ask a question too. So Adam?
Okay, so another question, Ursula seems to be saying that are arguing that you shouldn't limit like you should like engage with the students who are in the movement for school safety, etc. But you shouldn't limit it towards sort of gun control. What are the sort of like practical, sort of concrete like considerations of that? What sort of how do you envision that sort of like manifesting sort of like concretely, and like how do you deal with like how would you deal like concretely with how to, in doing that, not to like empower this sort of like, or not to like limit the movement just to gun control, just to the sort of legal aspect of gun control, or do you not sort of like see that as a concern? So like, how would you like concretely engage that task?
If the students are successful in actually getting the lawmakers of a state or even the country to pass gun control laws, I think that would be a tremendous showing of the power of people against their government. I'm completely and totally in support of that effort. I am not completely in support of saying that this is it. Now we've got gun control, we can go home, and we've done what we need to do. And this happens, it happens over and over. One of the organizations I'm with is Pelican Bay Hunger Strike Support Coalition, right? The prisoners went on hunger strike to say, we are not just gang members, we're human beings, and indeterminate solitary confinement is torture. We are opposed to this. It's absolutely a reform question. If you're not housed in solitary confinement, you're going to be housed in prison. How much of a difference is that? Prison reform is by definition reform. And yet those prisoners, when they finally won, and it was a real big surprise that they won, the minute they got into general population, they said, okay, now we call ourselves Prisoner Human Rights Movement, and we try to figure out how we get the prisoners in general population involved in struggling against the concrete conditions that are found in the general population. So it never ends with whatever the goal is. It continues, and it's that sense of what I do with my life that's revolutionary, as opposed to any particular goal, any particular expression of that in any particular movement. That keeps changing, but the universal of who we are, that we keep fighting for who we are, that's what revolution is all about. That's what permanent revolution means. Did that answer your question? I mean, I'm absolutely for passing gun control laws, but I don't think that that's going to be the difference between capitalist and non-capitalist state.
Yeah, I don't see how gun control laws help workers though, because it actually strengthens the state against workers. And ultimately there's a contradiction in our society between our state and the working class. Like, this state is designed, its entire purpose is to perpetuate the existence of private property. And that's when that's challenged is when they come out and actually become violent. All the oppressed layers in society, when they move, the reason the state attacks them doubly so is because it exposes everything in this society that is wrong and could lead towards a greater crisis where private property itself is challenged. So it doesn't address the question for me either, because the real problem we're experiencing is not that the abundance of guns is leading to gun violence. There's other societies where there are guns. I think Richard just pointed out how in Cuba, a good section of the population is trained in how to use guns. But do we hear about mass shootings in Cuba? Do we hear about mass shootings even in capitalist countries? It's not a phenomenon we see. We see it in American society, and I think the task that we have is figuring out why this is happening here, and what sort of what is it about the decay of American capitalism in particular that's causing it, and how can we, in unraveling that, how can we forward the workers' movement against the capitalist state, not strengthen the capitalist state by disarming workers?
Well, and also, I mean, the thing I would just add to that is that the Klansmen who carried out the murders in Greensboro were all acquitted. And that's not exceptional. All the Klansmen who carried out the murders all through the South in the Civil Rights Movement, who were armed, they were all, virtually all acquitted. The police who carry out murders are all acquitted. So there's an alliance between the extreme right and the state. In fact, you could view the Ku Klux Klan particularly when the Ku Klux Klan was huge, and it's growing again, as really an adjunct to the state, to the repressive arms of the state. And so if we call for gun control, they're not going to be controlled. That side is not going to be controlled. We know who the gun control will be enforced against, particularly in times of crisis. So, you know, that I think that's just, we have to be realistic and not live in a world of you know, that, you know, there's some kind of equality that's going on, and somehow that would, those laws would be enforced in a fair and just way. Nothing is enforced in a fair and just way. So that wouldn't be.
All right, so question?
I was going to say briefly, we just, shameless plug for our reading group, we address like the fundamental questions, namely that Marx was actually not concerned with exploitation or a moral critique of capitalism, not at all. Not that that didn't factor in, but that wasn't the reason why he did what he did or wrote what he wrote, not at all. The point of the commodity form is that it points beyond itself and that it's in crisis under capitalism. But actually, Marx didn't invent some new kind of freedom. It's bourgeois freedom. It comes from bourgeois ideas. The bourgeois revolutions, the American Revolution. So it's a continuation of the American Revolution, socialism. It's not an antagonizer of that. But back to gun control. It seems like in the absence of an actual socialist party, this question among people on the left is, it ends up being reduced to the framework of capitalist politics, namely pro or anti-gun control. And in a similar sense, when we were discussing like geopolitical issues earlier, in the absence of an international, these questions inevitably get reduced to sort of like ideological advocacy for groups that are opposing imperialist powers. And I think that, I don't know, I guess my question would be, how would you connect, for all of the panelists, how would you connect like Democratic Party-sponsored gun control activism to the failure of the left, specifically with paying attention to the party question? I mean, because I recognize that it's difficult. Like, how do you address, like Lenin and Steiner, how do you address the special bodies of armed men question without the goal of smashing the state? How do you not support like hashtag not one more and March for Our Lives, like you've talked about, but hope to actually like practically address the problem of gun violence? We just saw another mass shooting yesterday. So this is really relevant right now. So I'm very sympathetic to the idea that like, obviously without the party, without actually smashing the state, achieving socialism on the way to communism, you can't really actually address this issue. But it doesn't seem like we're near that, practically speaking. So what do you really do on the left without just dissolving your sort of radicalism into Democratic Party movementism and bolstering the Democrats from the base, so-called base? How would you address that?
Well, from where I'm sitting, what is incumbent upon the left is, as opposed to having a program and a description of what socialism is and whatever, it's to actually work out, and I appreciate the question about not having enough of a theoretical depth in the US, to address the question of what is the difference between capitalism and post-capitalism. It can't be just a question of the state. It has to be something very fundamental about how we live as human beings together. And the difference between capitalism and post-capitalism is something that emerges every time people say, what exists is not adequate to me as a human being. I don't want to be killed in the school, right? I don't want to experience this violence. Well, what does that mean about what kind of society we need? And if the left could engage in a theoretical discussion that Marx did in pointing beyond capitalism, I think we would be much further in seeing what are the possibilities that are opened by March for Our Lives that are not exhausted in bourgeois politics, that cannot ever be usurped by bourgeois politics because we have this view of where we're going.
I think your question sounded like a two-part question. I mean, or there was at least one assertion in there that I want to talk about as well about essentially some identity between Marxism and a liberal conception of freedom. I'm not sure to what degree that exists, and I do want to address that. But your question about the Democrat Party first, I don't think there's a way around it. Ultimately, we need the working class in this country to organize itself politically in a mass party. This isn't to say that it's some small socialist group is going to explode and become the mass party itself mechanically. I think one of the fundamental tasks of Marxists today is to organize a mass socialist party in this country that seeks to connect with the international proletariat. And I don't think you can go around the question of the need to smash the state. And the question of gun control to me is absolutely related to that. But we should have a sense of proportion about this. The function of a party is not to actually carry out the task of the working class itself. It's to direct and guide the working class towards them. It's the working class that smashes the state, not any sort of party that we can form, because it is a sort of large-scale thing we're talking about with that. So again, the gun control question ultimately with that also relates to, let's not mystify it. Let's gun control is not a solution to gun violence. And I think like Richard's been stressing too, it's not going to be applied equally. If we advocate more gun control, ultimately the oppressed layers in this country, black workers, Hispanic workers, and other oppressed workers in this country are going to face the brunt of that, are going to face the brunt of that being another excuse for their lives being unsafe. But I think what Ursula, that's pointed out about sort of a non-capitalist conception of society is also important. I think that relates to what you were saying about some sort of identity between liberal notions of freedom and Marxist notions of freedom. I don't think that's exactly true. Whereas the liberal notion of life, that being a right, is a negative right. So the state does not take the right away from you. That's how rights are portrayed in liberalism, is that they're negative rights. Something can be impinged upon you. The socialist conception.
Rousseau, not just Locke. Sorry. Rousseau, not just Locke. Sorry.
Okay. That's fair. The general point is that capitalism will contradict itself, and it's unable to actually complete those tasks. To that degree, you're right, of the American Revolution. But if we're going to talk about it that way, we need to also be clear about the fact that there wasn't one American Revolution. The very fundamental tasks of even a right to life under a bourgeois system where the mode of exploitation was slavery were unaddressed. It took another social revolution, and that's what the Civil War ultimately was. It changed the relation, the mode of exploitation in the country entirely. So at that level, it was a social revolution, moving from one mode of exploitation to another. It wasn't simply a civil war. Even in there's unresolved questions in that need to be negated again and again for there to be a real conceptualization of just sticking with life, right? The right to life that socialists understand is a positive affirmation, which is very different from the sort of bourgeois right to life that
Rousseau?
yeah, sure. Rousseau is an influence on Marx, and to that degree, you can say that Marx was in the tradition of liberal philosophers, but ultimately he is not a liberal philosopher. He did break from that milieu pretty sharply. And he has a different sort of material understanding of that right to life as well. And you're right, Rousseau is an influence on Marx, so is Hegel. You could talk about Hegel as a bourgeois philosopher as well, but I'm just pushing back on that notion as being somewhat of an overstatement. There is a difference, I'd say, between a Marxist conception of freedom and a liberal one.
And I think that the Civil War was a revolution. I'm not so sure about what happened in 1776. There's a very interesting book by Gerald Horne called The Counter-Revolution of 1776, which argues that really the victory of the Americans, the white American colonists, was a historic defeat for black people. And I think that's true. And I think it was also a big defeat for indigenous people. The American Revolution, the leaders of the American Revolution and the strongest advocates of it, and it's kind of interesting because it's kind of like along the lines of the most left force in Israel when it was formed. the most left of the so-called socialist groups, which was also the most aggressive about getting land. That's how it was in the American Revolution. And their conception of empire was a real conception of empire. The British Army advertised that if black people fled to the British lines, they would be welcomed there. This happened also in the War of 1812. And that the victory, I mean, look at the world today. Was the American Revolution so great? Now we have this gigantic superpower that dominates over everybody else in the world because it was able to gain control of the empire. I'm not arguing that the British Empire is good, but I don't think the American, I think people got to check out again what really happened in the American Revolution. The French Revolution was what was the revolution that began to really knock down feudalism, to smash feudalism. But the American Revolution, I think, was actually a victory of a reactionary empire. I wanted to say one other thing, though, in regard to what do we do between now and the time of the revolution. I think of the points that I made for a program, that building organization would be the most important thing that we could do. We live in the most atomized society ever, that people have so little feeling that they're responsible for each other. I mean, if you go to other countries, even other capitalist countries, there's more of a sense of community than there is here. Here the atomization matches the magnitude of capitalist exploitation and capitalism just in general. So people are separated from each other. If you watch the mass media, most of the mass media in the United States, most comedy that's on is about making fun of people at the expense of others. That's a lot of the whole basis of it. It's like that's okay, that's good. And when people are so atomized, they don't really realize, like you hear people talk after the shooting yesterday that you referenced, and they say, yeah, I always thought that guy was really, I wasn't surprised that he did this. But if there was some form of real organization among the students, among workers, a union, it's a lot less likely that that kind of thing happens in unionized workplaces. It's not entirely absent, but if people are working together, if there's organizations in communities, I mean, you'll hear U.S. officials talk a lot about civil society and the lack of civil society in Cuba. There's immense civil society in Cuba. And they say, well, it's all spying, they're spying on each other in the committees for the defense of the revolution. When the earthquake happened in San Francisco, I was here in 1989, thousands and thousands of elderly people were alone in their single room occupancy hotel rooms without food because they turned off the gas, and the restaurants, the cheap restaurants that they went to had no food. I experienced this in bringing food to people. And I was thinking at that time, wow, I wish they had somebody looking out for them. But they don't have anybody looking out for them. People die all the time alone in this society. The level of atomization is incredible compared to most of the rest of the world. And overcoming the problems of society would be greatly enhanced. And that will have to happen on the road to revolution. There will have to be built strong organizations, not just the party, but all kinds of organizations that have a revolutionary orientation.
Okay, so it's nearing the end towards the presentation. We were gonna end roughly around 4:30, so I think we should have each panelist do like 3 to 4 minutes closing remarks, similar to their responses. But I haven't asked a question yet. So my question is kind of it seems like it's been kind of like addressed already. The point has been brought up, like what does the left do, And yeah, it seems like a general, I guess, area of agreement, if I'm understanding all the speakers correctly, is that ideally, the state would be disarmed for any kind of like gun control legislation, and we would prefer, and there's been this thought like, we would prefer like the state disarmed and like the workers are more armed in the context of a kind of like socialist revolution, but that's not the case today. That's a general theme that I'm seeing. And so I'm wondering, because I scan the internet today and I'll see like this high percentage of US citizens support gun control. So I guess it is a general question that I think each speaker could tie into their closing remarks, which is, what does the left do when workers want gun control and want to rely on the state to stop crime rather than civil society organizations?
Am I going
Whoever wants to go first.
But are we doing closing statements or questions still?
Oh, no, I said, like, my question I thought was kind of had been addressed already in some sense, so I was going to try to combine that with closing statements.
So my closing statement is going to be very simple. At a pretty recent demonstration, a former prisoner addressing people who were there opposing criminal justice system said, and disorganized truth has little chance against organized lie. That was coming from where he is coming, where the organized lie is the lie of the prison industrial complex and the whole so-called justice system, about the dangerousness of specifically young black men, which is who he is. And the thing that was so striking to me in addressing what you're saying is that the most important thing in his view, being a former prisoner, is that we have to organize not just people to come out to most demonstrations or to defend themselves, but the most important thing is to organize our truth. What do we mean by the society that we want to live in? And that's the really critical question that is coming up from people who experience the inhumanity of where we are and want a vision of something better. So that's to me is the task of the left, is to address this question of organizing our truth. Not just people, but organizing what we're here for and what a human society is.
William, for the record, I just want to say I think your question is a pretty good closing prompt. I like it because it helped me figure out what I wanted to say as a closing comment. And that's a really good question too. Like, what do you do in a period when it seems like workers are the ones that want more gun control? I think we answer that the same way we can answer any question where workers are drawing the wrong conclusions or want the wrong things. We need to take a step back and realize that by and large, human consciousness is not progressive or revolutionary. It's inherently conservative. We evolved as we're animals. We're afraid of the dark. We don't like change. If tomorrow the laws of physics were different, we'd be very disoriented. It's only after a series of events forces an individual, and then even beyond an individual, a class of people, to repeatedly try to do what it was doing before, to go back to when it thought things were better, or use old methods to make things better. Once they keep failing with that, events are the only thing that will make the working class shift its consciousness. Our task isn't to meet them where they are, it's to point out the objective reality of things, where the objective conditions are, and what the objective interests of the working class are internationally. So that's what I think is important, is pointing out, promoting Marxist ideas, and building, from my perspective, the perspective of the International Marxist Tendency, building an international revolutionary organization that's doing this sort of work across the world, but pointing towards revolutionary conclusions and doing that sort of patient work where the working class, through a series of approximations, will go a few different ways, and it will test a few different ideas, and it will seem to move left and right, but eventually it does draw sort of revolutionary conclusions. And at that point, of course, we address things differently. But the only point I'm trying to make here is we shouldn't give up on Marxist precepts just because, for now, it seems the workers have. I haven't seen the statistic you're talking about, but apparently you're suggesting that the majority support gun control. That's not necessarily always going to be the case.
Well, actually, I want to just, I agree with a lot of that, but I do want to say something in closing about the Middle East, which came up and we talked about earlier. And that is this, is that I've traveled to Lebanon, to Iraq, to Tunis, and so forth. and in recent years, and there's a great fear in the Arab world among the Arab left, I mean, among the socialist, communist left, and that is of ISIS and the rise of these jihadist groups. And it was especially sharpened by what happened in Iraq in 2014 when they were able to take over a large part of the country, a shockingly large part of the country. And I think that we have to try to think about what that would mean for a society that we lived in, if those forces succeed in taking over. I mean, there would be no more left, because they would be executed. They would all be executed. And I think the vast majority, my observation is the vast majority of the Arab left, which has been decimated and had to face the rise of the takfiris, the jihadist groups. But it would be the end. It would be really the end. Your life would be, and for women, it would be, you can't go out anymore. You stay home. And if you do go out, you have to go out with a male relative. And you have to be wearing an outfit where only your eyes can be seen, if that. I mean, this is what we're talking about in Syria. That's the reality of it. That's the reality of the alternative that was going to develop in Syria. That it wasn't, as I said before, an alternative between the Assad government, of which we have had many criticisms. They've collaborated at times with US imperialism in very bad ways, in Lebanon, in regard to the first Iraq war, and so forth. We know that. But their sin was that they weren't willing to be completely subordinate, and they weren't subordinated. So what's your preference? A bad Assad government, or an Assad government with problems, or ISIS and Al-Qaeda? Those are the alternatives. There weren't other alternatives. And the idea that you could imagine there was a third way, it didn't exist. And it's only those who advocated the third way, this mythical third way, in the Middle East, and they were very, very few in number, who took that position. I mean, I was with a very wide range of the left in Lebanon last year, and that was exactly what the viewpoint of people was. I think we have to think about, what if it was us? What if it was us having to live under such a regime?
Could I push you a little bit to say like a final word on the whole Second Amendment?
The Second Amendment.
Or the
What's
gun,
it?
the gun control thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, right now, we don't have much of it. I mean, it doesn't make it unimportant to take a position. It's important to take positions on everything, but we're not going to really influence that debate. The revolutionary left, the socialist left, is not going to have. But it's important, and I wanted to make the point that in the points that we raised about things that need to be done, many of them I think would be fine with young people, the students who are calling, the march. There's going to be a march tonight, by the way, in San Francisco. And there's been a lot of demonstrations actually in the last few days, and I think that's also a point that is of the greatest importance. I mean, are we engaging in protest? Are we engaging in struggle? There was a big demonstration at the Israeli consulate about their policy of massacres without which there would be no, without massacres there'd be no Israeli state. So 700 people were out on Tuesday, hundreds of people came out on Wednesday, scores of people disrupted Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, and another war criminal inside his address. So, I mean, being engaged in the struggle is the most important thing of all. We can't just theorize. We have to be engaged in the struggle. And if we engage in the struggle, if we go to the marches, if we go with a platform like what I'm talking about with the flyer that we have, we can engage with people and we can have discussions with people. I mean, I think there's questions about certain aspects of it, like the availability of automatic weapons. I mean, like, that's a question. I'm not saying that we should say. I mean, they're actually banned in most places. Some places they're legal. A lot of places the semi-automatics can easily be converted and so forth. I mean, we should talk to people, but I think we've established our fundamental position. We're not for having more government gun control, because we know how inequitably that's going to be enforced and who it's going to be enforced against and so forth. But I think that what's really important is to go out and talk to people and to be able to have a program. And, you know, people don't have to agree with everything in order to have a discussion. As a matter of fact, if they did, you wouldn't have to have the discussion.
All right, well, give it up for all of our panelists. Clap it up for them.